Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for our 6th annual Technology, Sustainability, and Business Forum, where we bring together leaders from industry, finance, academia, and not-for-profit sectors to discuss matters pertaining to sustainability. My name is Daniel Tachik. I'm the Executive Director of Carnegie Mellon's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. And as a university-wide institute focusing on energy and sustainability, we focus on developing and demonstrating the technologies, systems, and policies needed to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable future. And part of the way that we do that is by collaborating to run events just like this one to help educate and inspire new ideas that drive sustainable business. Today's event is co-hosted by the Scott Institute and the Tepper School of Business here at CMU. So a special thanks to Nick Muller and Ashley Kluginski over at the Tepper School for helping put together a great program for today. So I'm super excited for today's panelists who have some very interesting insights to share. So to keep from taking time away from them, I will pass things off to Christina Goller and Christian Barrero, two master's students in public policy in the Heinz School, to introduce today's speakers and moderate today's discussion. Again, thank you so much to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you. So, my name is Christian Barrero, a public policy and management master's program, but I am with Christina taking the sustainable business course with Professor Muller. So that's kind of how we ended up here.
Yeah, and I'm in the same program, same year as Christian, and I have an additional connection to sustainability on campus. I serve as one of the interns at CMU's campus-wide sustainability initiative. So to get us started a little bit, I wanted to orient our audience before our discussion. So why don't we go around the room and introduce ourselves? Ryan, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Worsing. I am the Director of Sustainability at Pittsburgh Regional Transit, PRT. Those of you might formerly have known us as the Port Authority of Allegheny County. We're PRT now and have been for the past couple of years. And I've been in this role for not a full year yet, but I'm coming from the Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI, an energy consultancy and think tank, where I did work in Pittsburgh previously, and I'm a Pittsburgh native, so been here off and on my entire life. Previously did some work with fossil fuel divestment at my own graduate university, and so I've kind of speak the language of maybe some of our student attendees here, but just really happy to be here and be part of this conversation.
Thanks so much. Pascal, we'll pass it to you next.
Thanks, Christina. I'm Pascal Lavoie. I'm Vice President of Breakthrough Technology Strategy with Alcoa. Alcoa is an aluminum producer, vertically integrated. It's a global corporation, and it's headquartered in Pittsburgh.
Thank you. Next, we'll pass it to Fran.
Hi, I'm Fran Moore. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at University of California, Davis. My research kind of focuses on the intersection of climate change and human well-being. And then I also have experience in academic year 2022 to 2023. I served in the Council of Economic Advisors as a senior economist covering climate and environment issues. CEA is a kind of small, almost like an economic think tank that sits within the executive office of the president. So I'm not speaking here in any way on behalf of the administration, but I can draw on those experiences in my comments today.
Thank you. Next, we'll pass it to Wallas.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me as a part of this forum. My name is Wallas Wiggins. I am recently retired from John Deere, Deere & Company, an agricultural and construction equipment manufacturer, global company as well. But I am also an alumna. I got my BS in electrical engineering in the 80s, and I went to, before the Tepper School was the Tepper School, it was GSIA. So I graduated GSIA as well with my MSIA. Really, really glad to be here. I've had responsibility at Deere as the vice president of global supply chain, but as part of that role, I had executive responsibility for a number of the swim lanes related to sustainability in scope 1, 2, and 3. So really glad to be here and learn and to share my input.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Arik, if you could give us an intro.
Hi, everybody. I'm Arik Levinson. I'm an economist at Georgetown University, where I teach and do research on public finance, environmental economics, and climate. I spent the last 2 years at the U.S. Department of Treasury working on climate policy. People may not realize this, but thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. Treasury Department is arguably the most important U.S. federal agency working on climate issues, because so much of the Inflation Reduction Act is tax policy. And 14 years ago, I also had Fran's job at the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration.
Thanks so much, everyone. And this is a reminder to everyone to submit questions via the chat. Okay, so let's get started. Let's begin by having the panelists discuss their professional role and how that role pertains to the notion of sustainability. Can each of you begin by providing your working definition of sustainability and how you measure it? Once again, in the hot seat, we got Ryan.
Well, I'm going to cheat. In my very first answer, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to provide the United Nations definition of sustainability, just as a level set for all of us, I think, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's a pretty broad view, but I'm speaking, I think, for transportation and for public transit in particular. And so for us, it means going net zero by 2045. That is our broad climate goal passed in our climate action plan in April of this year. And within that are interrelated goals to be more climate resilient, to manage our resources and the energy that we use in a responsible way. And depending on who you talk to, it also includes things like financial sustainability, because we as an organization are only as helpful to the climate as we are sound financially. So it can kind of go all over the place, but anytime I need to remind myself what sustainability means to me, I go back to that UN definition, because I think that it never fails.
Yeah, thank you so much. Pascal, any reactions?
Yeah, I think that's a good start, Ryan. My role at Alcoa and the Breakthrough Technologies is really to attempt at reinventing our industry for a sustainable future. So I feel like I'm super connected to the topic today. Our practical definition of sustainability at Alcoa is to pursuing of the practices that minimizes our social and environmental impacts. So we have operations globally, and we really strive to adhere to the utmost standards in terms of operating practices. We want to create value for our stakeholders, but also create value for our host communities. And these two are not mutually exclusive. We believe that they are well connected together. I think the measurement of this is super important as well. So in metal extraction and production, we measure sustainability through key metrics, such as carbon intensity in our production processes, resource efficiency, but also the advancement of the technologies that minimize the environmental impact. And we do a lot of emphasis on the transparency and the reporting of these metrics. So we're aligning with global standards like the ones of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, and also the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, ASI. So to me, it's important that we're transparent about our progress in sustainability and make sure this is adhering to standards and third-party verified as well.
Thank you. Fran, any reactions?
Yeah, I think I could really build on kind of what Ryan kind of mentioned, that I also think that Brundtland Commission definition is valuable. The way it's kind of been operationalized within economics in the decades since then is in terms of what kind of holistic capital accounting. So if you kind of think, what does it mean to really measure this for not like future well-being, like you can formalize that as a kind of holistic capital account where capital is valued at the stream of benefits it provides into the future. And like, normally we think of capital as these kind of manufactured physical capital, like roads and bridges and factories. And those are definitely kind of important, but a kind of sustainable definition of capital accounting is going to bring in the other important sources of capital, particularly natural capital, like the kind of the benefits we get from ecosystem services, as well as like human capital and kind of the, health and well-being and education and opportunities in a kind of population. And so I find that really valuable in my work, in my kind of more like a more applicable everyday definition in the kind of my own like personal consumption decisions. I like to think of like if everyone were to live the way I lived in the world, like, you know, would we blow past our like environmental thresholds? And like for my personal consumption decisions, that pushes me, I would say, towards kind of lower impact, transportation modes, lower impact dietary choices and things like that.
Thank you. Wallace?
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add to the definition. Everybody said it, maybe using different words, but basically it's working and acting responsibly now to make sure we don't compromise the future state for the world around us. And it's pretty simple to me. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. And at Deere, we look at a number of factors when we measure sustainability. Obviously, a lot like I think Pascal mentioned, manufacturing, we're a big manufacturer. We look at CO2 reduction as a goal we're trying to achieve, efficient resource uses, wastewater management, things of that nature. But something I don't want to miss, and I think somebody alluded to it, is this, I call it human enablement. There's a factor in this that says, in all that you do in your process, that we do in our processes, our systems, our organizations, our factories, there is an element of it that we can't ignore, which is the human factor, and I call it community. It's making sure governance is in place to make sure whatever we do, we're doing it properly. Somebody mentioned reporting, compliance. Those are big, big factors in being transparent with this. But also, my stance has been, since I have had responsibility for all the suppliers of John Deere, both manufacturing suppliers, logistics suppliers, everybody can participate and everyone will participate because they're very large companies. They have the ability to do great things with sustainability. Small companies go, I've got a 10-man shop. What can I do? My philosophy has been everyone can do something. And that's where the water management, the waste management, recycling, lifting your communities, things like that factor in as well.
Thank you. Arik?
Sure. I think sometimes panels like these can be more interesting if people disagree a little bit. So let me play the role of contrarian. I don't really use the word sustainability because I think it's come to mean so many different things to so many different people. It's too imprecise. The UN Sustainable Development Goal that Ryan cited as an example, it lists 17 goals. They're poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, water, affordable energy, decent work, economic growth, inequality. It's kind of all the good stuff. If an agenda that includes everything good just means we're going to solve all the world's problems. And to me, economics is about trade-offs. We have limited resources, and a dollar spent feeding children can't be spent on clean energy, much as we would value both goals. And the challenge is weighing these competing goals. Sometimes the goals are complementary, but often there are trade-offs. Affordable clean energy. Well, sometimes clean energy is more expensive than the cheap, dirty stuff. And so we're making a trade-off between affordability and cleanliness. Electric cars are heavier and cause more fatalities. That's a trade-off we have to face head on. There's a Dutch economist who won the first Nobel Prize in economics named Tinbergen, and he has a principle named after him, which is that if we have multiple policy objectives, we need multiple policies. So if we have 17 policy goals, we need at least 17 policies, and that seems sensible. We shouldn't try to solve gender equity with climate policies or design one regulation that's going to address both hunger and affordable energy. So I've been focused on climate policy, which is a measurable, tangible thing, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, degrees of warming. And I'm comfortable that achieving that climate goal may make it more difficult or costly to achieve other goals. And that's a trade-off I want to spend time thinking about.
Thank you so much. Ask Christian for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So clearly this is an amazing panel, and you're all outstanding. We have kind of representation from NGOs, from manufacturing companies. Maybe some of you formerly worked in public service, academia. So how do you view the role of these different sectors in the economy that I just listed out when it comes to sustainability? And this time we're going to start with Dr. Pascal in the hot seat.
Thanks, Christian. I'm trying to sink in Arik's contrarian views, and they're super interesting, and I'm not sure I disagree with them. If you allow me, I'll start with a bit of a specific example on how aluminum is actually trying to clean up its act. Production of aluminum is super important. It's pivotal to the transition, but it's a material that's energy intensive to produce, and it's got a ramification in terms of residue that we're leaving behind as well. So we're really focusing on reducing our environmental footprint. I think globally, aluminum production is 3% of the CO2 emissions in the world. It's not huge, but it is substantial. But the problem is that it's very difficult to abate. And being energy intensive, it's important that we're actually transitioning to renewable energy. So Arik's point on that being more expensive at the moment than more dirty energy is a bit of a trade-off that we need to make. Alcoa has progressed quite a bit on this. We currently have 87% of our smelters powered by renewable energy. It's substantially up in the last decade, and it's something that we need to continue doing. So we're committed to more sustainable mining, refining, and aluminum production as well. We do investment in breakthrough technologies. That's my role. And one example of this is a technology we call ELYSIS. It's a partnership with a competitor, Rio Tinto, and also the government of Quebec and Canada into developing hard-to-abate technology and deploying it. This would completely eliminate the direct emissions of CO2 from the aluminum production. It's something that's in early scaling up. We're not at deployment yet, but we're really putting a lot of efforts in that. So if I take that into now, taking it back to a more manufacturing and metal extraction sector, I think the approach needs to be similar, which is driving innovation, embracing renewable energy, but efficiently, and also prioritizing the circular economy, valorizing our byproducts. This is what we're trying to do, and I think it's valid for all manufacturing sector.
All right, thank you. So with that, we're going to pass it to Arik, actually. So there can be a little bit of a direct response there.
Yeah, so I'm a researcher and a teacher, and I don't do anything as concrete as Pascal or Wallas or Ryan. Fran's in the same boat as me. But I think the role we play is thinking hard about the trade-offs that I described, and in the roles that both Fran and I fulfilled working for presidential administrations in helping to try to design policy. The Inflation Reduction Act that I spent the last 2 years working on is an example. It's President Biden's signature piece of climate legislation. And it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, and perhaps the title is a tell because the act is trying to achieve a lot of simultaneous objectives that are unrelated to climate. National security, income inequality, domestic protectionism. And as a consequence, academic research that is estimating the effect of the Inflation Reduction Act on climate suggests that any carbon reductions that it achieves will be expensive carbon reductions. And that's because it's trying to achieve those multiple goals. Now, maybe that's worth it because we're trying to achieve multiple things at the same time, but we have to recognize that if it's climate policy, it's an expensive climate policy. So the role of academia in all of this is basically advice, and it's valuable only to the extent that the advice is taken. And so that makes the role a little bit more backseat to the ones that some of the others on this panel are taking.
That makes complete sense. Thank you so much, Arik. So now we're gonna move to Fran to respond here.
Yeah, so I do agree with Arik that like the kind of academic role is often one of kind of providing objective, kind of detailed analysis, and having kind of been in government for a while, I can say that that is extremely valuable in the policy process. And there's a lot of like, it can be a noisy information environment that moves quickly, where you're kind of quickly trying to get to grips with some complex kind of technical details, and having a kind of, information from, at least to the first order kind of disinterested parties, and sound that's based on sound analysis and good technical detail is incredibly valuable input into that process. I can also speak a little bit, I think, to the role of government here. And I think, when we talk about sustainability, the role of kind of just individuals, or kind of individual like communities or individual companies is clearly kind of important, and they can play, I think, really important like catalyzing roles. But ultimately, what we're trying to do here is a kind of collective endeavor, and governments are kind of the vehicle by which you organize those collective endeavors. And so ultimately, like, this move towards sustainability is going to be kind of more effective, more efficient, and just generally kind of better if it's kind of coordinated in some way through government action.
Awesome. How about you, Wallas?
Yeah, so your view arc is not a contrarian view. What you spoke is truth, and we deal with that every single day. I could buy the greenest materials that anybody could imagine, my company would go out of business because it would cost so much, and I can't do that. Or to your point, I can make sure every supplier in every small community is taking care of that community, doing things to lift that community. But again, I'd probably go out of business after a while. So the reality is, this is a very delicate balance across a lot of things. And I personally, in business, am a firm believer, if you give people more than 5 things to do, nothing's going to get done. So to your point, there are many, many goals. And I think it's almost like you're multiplexing between them to some extent. But in the end, the role that I think we play as a large manufacturer that accounts for a lot of greenhouse gas emission, if you want to use that as an example, it's really threefold. I think the first role is to make the world know that we are believers, because unfortunately, in business, there's still a lot of convincing to be done for leaders to step up and sign the check to put some of these things in place. So making sure people understand, where you're based, what you believe in, and that this is real, and we're going to go after it to the extent we can go after it. The second thing is to then lead. And the way I look at that is that John Deere, 10,000 suppliers around the world. I spend tens of billions of dollars. I have a lot of ability to stand as an example to them to say, here are the things we're doing. What can you do? One thing we did a lot of is the techniques, the tools, the processes we came up with, more than willing to share them with any company that wanted to hear about it. So to jumpstart them, to give them a chance and maybe getting ahead of the curve and putting some of these things in place. And then the last thing is this influence or incent. I think we have the ability, or we had the ability to do a lot of influencing of other companies. We have these supplier criteria we used called Achieving Excellence, and suppliers get points for cost, quality, delivery, technology, innovation, things like that. Well, we put some of the sustainability goals in there, said, if you can measure, you can document and prove that you are moving the needle in these things, that earns you value there as well. And those are the preferred suppliers that we would place contracts with. So I think as a large manufacturer in the same space where we know we're one of the big contributors, we've got a couple of roles that we can play. If we're serious about this, we've got a couple of roles we can play. We can't do it ourselves, but we can provide a tremendous amount of influence in the industries where we participate.
Right. Ryan, do you have a response?
I think I have slightly more than 5 things that I'm trying to get done right now, and it is a task to do anything more than one thing a lot of the time. I think my position here is a little interesting because I represent a government, but not one that really sets policy so much as implements the policies set by others and ultimately gets people to work. Not to please forgive the pun, but we're kind of where the rubber meets the road with a lot of these mandates from federal and state, and we deal with the money we've got, on top of a pretty sizable backlog of legacy infrastructure that needs to be repaired in order to keep the system functioning at just a basic level. So our position's unique, but our role within transportation is clear. And transportation in the United States anyway is how you measure is anywhere between 30 and 40% of the total emissions picture. That's huge. And the problem with that emissions is that it's really diffuse. Whereas with our power sector, which is still a huge issue, those emissions are generally, I could give you an Excel list with the 50 biggest power plants producing carbon tomorrow, and we could start there. When you're talking about every single driver in America, it's a much more difficult, almost behavioral psychology kind of problem. And it's personal economics beyond just sort of like, the balance sheets of single companies. And every person in the country is your target. And so we have a lot of direct emissions that we produce. We produce over 100,000, tons of CO2 in a given year. We're doing everything we can with our climate action plan to reduce those to zero. But we're also trying to simultaneously shift people away from their personal vehicles toward public transportation, because based on our math and the math of others in our sector, everyone who does that shaves about 50% of their emissions from transportation down. And if everybody does that, or even some small portion of people do that, the results are immense. I'll speak to some previous research I did at the last place where I worked, where RMI has found, in consensus with some others, that even if the electrification of our personal vehicles happens at a really aggressive pace, the most aggressive scenarios we can think of, you'll still need to shave off maybe about 20% of our total driving altogether. And the only way you do that is by offering those drivers a compelling option in the form of public transit, or you just tell them not to go anywhere at all, which is kind of impractical in our ever more connected, ever more mobile world. So we try to improve our service, expand our service where we can. It's difficult given the budgets that we've got to deal with, but we try to make ourselves as appealing as possible so that people can be empowered to make that choice.
All right, amazing. Thank you. It seems like with the consensus, or like what I hear, the little patterns are challenges with measurement, challenges with niching, sustainability. But then it's also interesting to hear how maybe there's push and pulls between all of your sectors, and kind of like Wallas mentioned before, kind of everyone has a role within sustainability. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back to Christina.
Yeah, so with that balancing act in mind, we've heard a lot about some key actions. It like kind of answered in the previous question, but are there any key steps that you feel that firms, consumers, or government agencies must take to maintain relevance in a sustainable future? And we're going to go back to the same order as we did for the first question, so we're going to throw it back to Ryan again. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was still reeling from that last question. Could you repeat this one, please?
Yeah. Are there any key steps that you feel that firms, consumers, or government agencies must take to maintain relevance in a sustainable future?
Well, I can give you another cop-out answer here and say that public transit ought to be relevant no matter what, because as I said in my previous answer, we're, depending on how you measure it, inherently sustainable. So we could do nothing and still be a sustainable option for people who are driving personal vehicles. Having said that, that's not the route we're going. We want to be a little bit more ambitious than that and not rest on that fact as an excuse for inaction. Transit in general, and I'll try to make this as broadly applicable to the room and not just talk about our own operations, but transit in general is a real inflection point in the country right now. You may have heard that PRT and SEPTA in Pennsylvania face some pretty significant funding shortages. This is not unique to transit agencies around the country. Transit in and of itself, as it's currently conceived, given the development patterns that we've allowed to exist over the past 50, 60 years, or even beyond, it is hard to turn a profit in transit, which is why it's so public. And so we really rely on an active, invested government that sees the value in transit, not only in terms of an end in itself, but also as an economic development engine and things like that. And so we're only as relevant as government kind of allows us to be. We're only as relevant as government funds us. Having said that, though, you know, the revenue from individual riders is something, and we're trying to make every step we can take to bring in more riders, not just to fund ourselves, but to grow the system, because there's a positive kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a positive feedback loop that happens just as more people ride public transit. The more people you ride, the more people you see riding and say, oh man, I could do that too. The more routes you get in service and so on. So we're trying to do things like our Partner Pass program, where big companies and entities can provide steeply discounted passes to everyone that works there as a way of getting more people on the bus or on the train. We're trying to use technology to update our systems, make it more user-friendly so that people know when their bus or their train is going to arrive, and so they don't have to miss anything and be late. We're just trying to make it easier for everyone. And the more we make it easier, the more I think that we'll continue to be relevant.
So much. Pascal, do you have any reactions?
Yeah, I think the manufacturing industry and the even heavy industry as well, they should and they do advocate for and collaborate with regulatory bodies. We need to support policies that incentivize us into sustainable practices and transparency, things that I mentioned before. So this helps actually in sourcing so that the consumers can make better decisions. So that partnership between regulatory bodies and operators or manufacturers is super important. For consumers, I think it's important that we have a personal view on what we do, the choices that we make. Some of the colleagues on the panel have mentioned that a lot of times it's about personal economy, but sometimes you can get incentivized to make better choices. I'll be self-centric here as well and advocate for recycling of aluminum. This is a metal that's highly recyclable. We say infinitely recyclable. It's almost true, but it requires people to make the effort to recycle it as well, especially consumers, so that on the post-consumer scrap we can recycle it. It's not a done deal, because every time we recycle aluminum, it's downgraded. So, for example, if you take a can, you cannot make another can from it because the top is not the same alloy composition as the body, put simply. But the industry is working hard. At Alcoa, we're developing a post-consumer recycling process that will enable us to take any post-consumer recycled scrap, aluminum-based that is, and then return it into a high purity, high value product. So we are trying hard, but we also need some help from the policymakers to retain the scrap within the countries of origin, so it's not exported and then we don't know what happens to it afterwards. So the US is exporting a lot of its scrap, and I think there's a lot to be done internally to help that out.
Thank you so much. I'll throw it to Fran. Oh, you're muted, Fran.
I'll talk about something maybe a little niche. We're kind of coming back to my definition of sustainability I talked about at the beginning, which is, I think there's like kind of government and academia, like between them, can play a role in the kind of statistical accounting system that we need to kind of just track sustainability. So one of the things kind of that I've like learned more about like history of economic statistics is kind of fascinating. Like when GDP was originally created, which was not that long ago, you know, people were saying like, this is not a welfare measure, right? We should not be using this to kind of track just like well-being in the country. And yet, to a large extent, it's kind of become like either GDP or as kind of some of its neighbors have become like the de facto metric that we turn to for that, because it's in the absence of anything better, I would say. And kind of this weakness has been known for a long time. And we can do better. And I think in that sense, like, I think the Biden administration did develop this, what is a long-term 15-year plan to develop a set of natural capital accounts for kind of environmental economic decision-making that would really kind of provide this needed kind of complement to, kind of our standard like set of economic statistics that we kind of know are missing important pieces related to sustainability.
Thank you so much. We'll pass it to Wallas next.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with what everybody has said. Just maybe a little nuance there. I think the keys are collaboration and incentives, some combination of the two. I briefly mentioned what we've done, but where I've seen traction is when organizations, it could be different organizations or different types of organizations, come together, share best practices without cost or anything, and leverage one another, to try to move the needle as it relates to sustainability. I don't know what the limit of government is to generate incentives, but again, as an organization, Alcoa, John Deere, whatever, we can do things within our small sphere of influence to do that. But I think something at a larger level is always important, because there's no doubt there's a cost here. A lot of companies either don't want to bear the cost or they can't bear the cost. But what I'm going to add to that is, the last thing I'm going to say is, to keep this relevant, is I will go back to my colleagues in academia. One thing that concerns me about sustainability is disinformation. There's a lot of people that don't believe because they're uninformed or disinformed. And I think to the extent the academic colleagues can make sure that as we measure, as we understand the implications, as we understand the cost downstream of non-sustainable practices, make those things really crystal clear and make them meaningful to consumers, to enterprises, to governments, to countries, whatever. I think that helps a lot. You hear about I'm in North Carolina now, hear about the big hurricane we had, and an area got hit that had never got hit with floods before, and it got absolutely devastated. They talked about, well, this is a function of climate change, and it kind of is said and goes on. It's like, no, stop. It needs to be made extremely clear to people, and legitimately, that these are the concerns. And you can't overblow it, or people will think, yeah, they're blowing smoke. I don't know if it's really that bad as a lot of us have heard before, but in some way to make the message crisp and believable and data-based, and keep it in front of people so they understand this is, you're robbing Peter today to pay Paul, or you're pay Paul later, whatever. But there's a real cost to not acting now. That's what I think keeps it relevant, because the relevance is governmental, it's corporate, it's individual. And I think somehow that strata has to be addressed on its own terms to understand this is something we need to keep top of mind as something that's really important for the future of our planet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Arik, any reactions?
Yeah, addressing disinformation gaps is a really big job. I'm not sure I'm up to it. I think the question posed is what are institutions, businesses, individuals, and academia and governments doing about climate change? And I think they fall into three buckets. One is things that people are doing anyway that can be relabeled as climate friendly. And I think recycling aluminum cans is one of them. Recycling aluminum cans is in Alcoa's best interest because it's cheaper to smelt to make aluminum from recycled materials than smelting new aluminum, and they've been doing that for a long time. It's a good thing to do. It also happens to be climate friendly. Second bucket is things that we do. We incur a little bit of cost, but we do it for climate reasons. I throw my aluminum. I walk an extra 10 feet to the blue recycling bin to throw my aluminum can away when I could just throw it in the trash. If I don't see a blue bucket, I might not carry it around for half an hour, but I'll incur some cost, and that makes a difference at the margin. Or as Fran said, I ride my bike to work sometimes. I'm not sure I do it for the climate reasons. I do it for the exercise, and when it's raining, I might drive my car, but it's costly to me. And the third bucket is things that we do that are a little bit performative. And my institution is an example of that. It does some things that are in its own interests, given the way the world is going. Like we've set up a environmental institution called Earth Commons that has lots of goals that are merged with sustainability goals. But we're in the business of education, and so it's a profitable enterprise setting up those programs. But we also do some things that are performative, like we contract to buy power from existing solar power plants. And we all know that when I turn on the lights in my office, it's not that some solar plant increases its electricity output. It doesn't matter that Georgetown has signed a financial contract with a solar plant. It doesn't cause more solar energy to be created when I turn on the lights. Georgetown also purchases carbon offsets, and there's lots of evidence that including from my colleagues here at Georgetown, that carbon offsets don't actually offset in much carbon. And so when we're doing that, we're doing a little bit of feel-good, performative sustainability practices. And I'm worried that some of that stuff may assuage guilt for other activities or abate the efforts. And so I'll go back to what Fran said, which I concur with completely, which is that we need government action, both as a coordinator and as a mechanism for incentivizing people to take actions that are costly. All those three buckets of activities by themselves aren't going to be enough.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll pass it to Christian for the next question.
Yes, thank you. And some of you mentioned this idea of trade-offs when it comes to the sustainability goals, kind of between themselves. There can also be some trade-offs between the goals of sustainability and maybe the pressures that each of your firms has, right? The other goals of your firms that might clash a little bit. At the same time, though, a more sustainable future kind of demands this idea of changing our current trajectory. So keeping that in mind, how do you see your individual organizations really igniting change towards a more sustainable future? And here, I'm actually not going to call someone out. Is there someone that wants to take that on first? I know it's a big question, so I also, want to let it simmer a little bit.
I'll jump in. So John Deere is the second oldest company in the United States. And one of our number one priorities is quality. Quality is a big deal. Safety is a big deal too, your worker safety as well. But, and this is a small example, but there was a time when quality was not as good as we wanted it. And so what the organization did said, you know what, we need to treat quality like safety. It's all about preserving human life, people, make sure nobody gets hurt, et cetera, and all that good stuff. And that simple tagline, as it spread around the enterprise globally, got people thinking about, wow, this is really important. You equate it to something that's important to every single individual, which is their personal safety. And I think to some extent, sustainability has to be communicated, shared, put forth in that fashion. It has to be something that everybody knows there's a cost to it. Walking 10 more feet to put the aluminum can in the bucket, but that there is tremendous value in it. And I go back to what I said before, and nobody's going to wake up and go, yes, this is the right thing to do, for crying out loud, we're going to do it. I think people have to be communicated to, organizations have to be communicated to, and the leadership of, this is my opinion, the leadership of the organization needs to be the number one cheerleader of this, and not broad, placating statements or anything like that, but a serious commitment to saying we're going to do this. It needs to rise to a strategic level in the organization. At Deere, we had it, and we had people managing the different areas of scope and swim lanes, and it became obvious that things get done when somebody in leadership, you hang it on them and they take responsibility for it. And therefore they went to the top level of the organization and they made sure everybody had something in the sustainability matrix that they were fully responsible for, like profit and loss, like quality, like managing the workforce. So even though it's another thing to add to the pile, it can be done. But my thought is that somehow the communication of it in the context of the broader scope of what's our mission, what are we all about as a business, it needs to be made clear that this is important. Again, that would translate down into the organization. And from my role, I've got a bunch of suppliers that I now have the right to go and to have the same communication conversations with, to help them understand, if you're going to support my organization, this is something your organization has to do. And if they're smart, they then go to their suppliers and try to implement the same thing. So it sounds weak, communication. Everything goes back to communication. But I think in an area where a lot of things are being held up as very shiny things we got to go after and got to fix now, if it doesn't have a place at that level and in that same light, that you run the risk of it going by the wayside or not being taken as seriously as it could or should.
And listen, communication is important. My grandma always says, it always goes back to communication with every problem. So is there anyone who has a response here?
Yeah, I think a lot's been said about the sort of assumed cost of sustainability. And I agree that that is on balance true, that, it's often the case that with increased sustainable actions up front, maybe it's a higher cost to do a more efficient building envelope or something like that. You do pay it off in time with energy savings and things like that. But that's, cold comfort a lot of the time to people that are really struggling to hold together a balance sheet. But in my business anyway, it tends to sometimes be the case that we can be so calcified in the belief that it is a cost that sometimes we neglect to mention that it is also a savings. It's a cost maybe, but there is also a savings added to it. And sometimes that savings is money. Sometimes that savings is time. Sometimes that savings is just, the stuff we're putting into air that none of us want to breathe, and I just want to make sure that as we're talking about the assumed cost of a lot of these things, that we're also talking about the savings and that, making sure that that nuanced picture still is maintained. In terms of transit, we can ignite change because transit is as much an input into as it is a function of the way our communities are designed and built. So for example, a transit-oriented community that's very dense, right, located next to a transit stop, maybe people there don't have to have cars, and they can ride transit to and from work or the grocery store or whatever. And likewise, if we're deciding where to put new service, it's easier for us to go to a place that's already dense because we know that there will be a lot of people that are there who will use the service. And so with that, the more we can work together with governments, which I think has been and private businesses and real estate developers and things like that, which I think has been a theme of this conversation, to create those communities, the more we can ignite demand for transit across our service network. And I think the last thing I'll say about it, again, when we're talking about the cost might be higher for us to build out that service, but we're also talking about a customer, or in our case, a passenger. And the cost might radically decrease for that person who isn't going to have to spend as much guaranteed every single day for their twice-a-day commute to get to work, and can hop on a train instead, read a book, and as they travel along. We might even be able to quantify in hours of their life that they have saved not sitting in traffic, which is something that nobody really wants to do, So the costs are there, they're real, we've got to be mature about them, but whose costs are they and what are the benefits as well?
That makes complete sense. And it kind of comes back a little bit to what Fran said before about capital accounting, right? The challenge of the short-term cost, but also how do you account for the future benefits at the same time? And how do you kind of balance those?
And some of those benefits are present benefits, it's just they're maybe sometimes undersold.
Thank you, Ryan. Anyone else have a response here? All right. Go ahead, Dr. Pascal.
Yeah, I would just wholeheartedly agree with Wallas and Ryan as well. For me, the ignition of change is really through leadership in the sphere that we have influence. Just like Deere, Alcoa is really thinking seriously about sustainable supply and going up the chain. And this is actually provoked by conversations we have with the public, the shareholders, the stakeholders, the communities, and it's a group's effort. So that leadership is important, and partnering up with groups that have that in mind is also important. There is this commitment called the First Movers Coalition, which is a set of businesses, a lot of them auto manufacturers, aerospace, but they commit to purchasing materials with a low carbon footprint for their manufacturing processes. Alcoa has been since the beginning within the discussions of this. Interestingly, we cannot be part of the First Mover Coalition because we don't buy metal, we sell it. So now we're joining the First Suppliers Coalition. So connecting with these first movers. So I think it takes a village to raise a kid. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Pascal. All right, any more responses here?
Let me raise one thing. There's an article in the New York Times this morning that the leaders of the big three American automobile companies are quietly lobbying the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, to preserve the Biden administration's strict greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles. And I wonder what the industry representatives here in this panel think of that. Is there some self-interested profit motive there that I can't figure out? Or is it that they're collectively worried about the environment and know that if they're collectively held to the task, they can accomplish it, but if they're freed of those regulations, they'll go back to the old ways? Or is this protectionism against foreign imports? Or I'm missing something. It's a very strange, it's a counterintuitive to me situation in which the industry is lobbying to preserve a costly piece of regulation.
This is, I'll take a stab at it, Arik. I think this is a good question. I haven't read the article, but I think it's what you suggest. To me, intuitively, I go there. It's not that it's helpful in the immediate term, but it might be in the long term. And that if you don't have a continuation of incentives to get something accomplished, it vanishes quite largely. I'm out of the reference there, but I recall when the steel industry was put under strict guidance to use SO2 scrubbers. I think it's back in the 70s or in the 80s. This was deemed to be super costly, but they were forced to do it. And then all of a sudden, the cost of the technology actually decreased relatively fast. And now it's a given. It's something similar with photovoltaic panels for domestic use. Japan really strongly incentivized people to do it. And it drove initially the cost of the technology to go down because of mass manufacturing. So we progress faster. So I think although it might be counterintuitive at the beginning because it's a costly thing to do early on, it might help getting it across the line cheaper down the road. Wallas, I don't know if you have a diverging view on this.
Oh, no, I agree 100%. You know, not to be a cynic, but I don't know many companies that do things just because it's a good thing to do, so we're going to do it. So the reality is that once they begin down that path of cleaner fuel, cleaner emissions vehicles, they change a lot of things in their manufacturing processes, their supply chain, a lot of things to meet that goal downstream. To stop it, to slow it down, to back it down, it tends to introduce inefficiencies into their organizations. And to Pascal's point, I think that the continuity, the knowledge of where we're going, we've put the building blocks in place to get there. We know in the future it'll actually probably be more cost effective for us now if we continue here. To slow that down, to stop it may actually be counterproductive to them as a business.
Right. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for that question, Arik. That was a really good question. So with that, I'm actually going to pass it back to Christina for the next question.
Yeah, so we're at a business school, and there are students from across campus at CMU here. We're talking to students, and a lot of us want to work in sustainability roles, myself included. I feel like the natural progression for this conversation is, what are your perspectives? Are the perspectives and bases of knowledge future leaders in sustainability roles? What are we going to need? Whether that be an actionable, tangible skill or some kind of knowledge base that we should understand. And this is open to anyone who would want to react first.
I would say congratulations, you've chosen a field which is not, where the demand for your services is not going to go away anytime soon, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have the answer to which part of that field, but remember there are 17 sustainability goals, and so just about anything you do fits this guidance.
I'll take a stab at it. I think one thing that's helped me out one day years ago, I was a novice at this, other than recycling cans and paper and things like that. But as time has gone on, it's become obvious to me that understanding processes, it could be transportation, it could be aluminum smelting, it could be making a combine, whatever. Understanding processes gives you a view, a mental view of the elements of doing something in a sustainable fashion, be it waste, be it use of water, be it emissions of sorts, things of that nature. So I think just generally speaking, and one of the reasons I actually went to GSI or to Tepper when I had a choice to go to school was the word on the street about Carnegie Mellon was it puts people out that know things, not that just can calculate things, but that know things. And it's always served me well, just getting involved in processes. I got to go visit a U.S. steel plant years ago when I was there. But understanding how things are done, how things are manufacturing, how processes work, I think is really, really key. The other thing I think that's important is, so we have these things called leadership competencies at John Deere. One of them is called engaging and inspiring. And you're thinking, what is he talking about? My sense is that because of the cost, be it real or perceived, because of the potential inertia, for a lot of political, whatever, a lot of reasons, the discontinuity between a mature place like the U.S. and maybe a less mature country and the way they do things, there is an amount of communication / selling that's going to need to be done. The people that lead sustainability initiatives, in my opinion, have to be very strong people. They have to be able to engage people with facts and data and be able to inspire them, and I use that term loosely, to really wake up the heart of that person to understand what we've all talked about, that, yep, it might be a bit of a greater cost now, but in the long run, it won't be. It'll actually be more beneficial. Understanding the current cost, the current benefits, but being able to convince people at times, or at least to continue to sustain people's trajectory at points where they feel, we've tried and it's just not worked, it's not worth it. Let's go back to the 08. No, we continue on the path. So those are the things that come to mind. I mean, the people at Deere that work on this, typically they're much younger people than me, so they're very passionate about it. But their knowledge base is heavy in process, and they're very good at sharing the business case. The why are we doing this? And they're very good at articulating the downside of not doing it. And I think that's part of any business case as well. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's what comes to mind.
No, that is incredibly helpful. I think we do focus and, we always do want to focus on what the positive is and we start there. But I think it's also important for us to acknowledge, hey, like there will be downsides to this. Something as simple as like the EV, we were talking about it in Dr. Muller's class. The EV subsidies weren't built or made for people who are below a certain income level. So I think having that depth of knowledge and understanding that is integral to the work that we're doing. And also to react to what you said about visiting U.S. Steel, I visited the Cary furnace, and I'm focusing on economic development and getting to hear from people who worked at that furnace and like who know the processes of it, like completely changed my own perspective. And it's so great as a student to participate in experiential learning like that and to even participate in this panel. So with that in mind, are there any other reactions to what Wallas said?
I would like to add one thing, and I really agree. I like that answer, Wallace. We talked a bit earlier about the communication and the disinformation, and I would encourage people that are trying to convince people of doing something or getting after an innovation, a piece of technology, increasing their sustainability, to really understand the ramifications. Because sometimes it's easy to sell a product that looks good on surface, or a technology or an initiative that looks good on surface, but then ends up not being what we really seek. What I mean by that is that oftentimes you have a really good piece of technology for a certain application, but it might not be the one for everything. I'll pick one example, and I think everybody will understand this one, which is green hydrogen. It's nice, it looks good. We could switch fuel everything to hydrogen, but producing green hydrogen is super energy intensive. So the exergy of that process is large. If there are pieces of processes, and it goes back to Wallace' advice about understanding the processes, if you've got processes that can be directly electrified rather than trying to fuel switch to a hydrogen, as a whole, we're better placed because we're going to use less energy doing it directly, potentially. So I think it's important to understand the limitations of what we're developing.
Thank you. Any other reactions?
Pascal, you need to talk to our maintenance department. I'll add only very quickly that I think the ability to come, just in terms of just skills to master, the ability to compartmentalize. This is a huge problem, and the only way to, eat an elephant is one bite at a time. I think that's the adage. The ability to compartmentalize and really project manage individual tasks, and also to have a certain level of emotional resilience to failure and bad news, and the inability to work outside the compartment that you're working in right now. It's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it is okay, and it has to be okay because you are the only vehicle you've got. And if you burn yourself out doing this kind of work, then the journey ends. It's something that you've got to just chip away at in the only way you can, and that is to be emotionally resilient to good news and bad. Something that I think we all struggle with from time to time. And also just to question the status quo as much as you can. I was reading the news the other day that in our current status quo, a single Netflix movie produced for Netflix has a budget of like $400 million. Do you know how much I could do with $400 million? 2 Netflix movies, and I give you an entirely new electric bus fleet. I could do that tomorrow if I had 2 Netflix movies worth of budget to do that with. I personally see that as a societal failing. You may disagree, that's okay. But just to question the status quo and to always, have an answer for when someone says that it can't be done.
This is maybe a little self-interested on our disciplines, but I would say I think a kind of understanding, I'm going to throw in economics. Like, I think the kind of process-based technical understanding is really important, right? Like, you really have to know how things are made, how the world works, but then that is also about how our actions kind of integrate into the wider economy. And because we are in this kind of globally interconnected, big economy that we live in, and, our actions are not independent of each other. And I think developing that set of kind of good intuitions that's grounded in, what is a set of trade-offs at the end of the day. And I think that is really valuable for to kind of lead you away from what Arik talked about, which is this kind of performative actions of organizations, and instead towards what is genuinely kind of, strategically the most effective thing your organization could be doing for sustainability. And so I've been like really impressed by, I think, some companies that think strategically and in a targeted way about the sustainability investments, and as opposed to kind of buying offsets or buying these kind of rec products that are meeting certain nominative kind of nominal targets, but are really kind of not doing anything substantive. And so like one example I think is interesting is the company Stripe, which kind of put these investments into like kind of unusual, like very early stage long-term carbon removal products. It's a little random for a kind of payments company, but they kind of thought, if ultimately, this might be a really important sector in like kind of to solving climate change. It's still very like these technologies are extremely early. And if essentially we can put our money into like catalyzing a few early stage products to essentially see if they work or not, and to get these companies like into a like more demonstration mode. That's just a good strategic use of our resources. Like that's kind of potentially has as much bigger effect than like, buying kind of renewable energy credits and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm now going to pass it back to Christian for our next question.
Okay, and I'll introduce this question actually with your analogy, Ryan, because I've never heard of that, but biting the elephant, like kind of like, so eating the elephant one bite at a time.
Yeah.
The elephant feels huge. It might not be an elephant, it might be like a mountain, maybe even like a whole planet, right? Like when I really try to like scale it. We get flooded with so many environmental news, and it can be very overwhelming, right? I actually literally have friends telling me, just like jokingly, oh, like, what's the point? We'll be dead in 2050, right? Like you literally like hear these type of rhetoric. So with that in mind, I kind of would like to know if there are any projects or successes that you guys have worked on that, I don't know, can give us a little bit more hope.
I'll answer quickly. My former employer, RMI, is really good about preaching a gospel of what they call applied hope. It's a little techno speaky, but essentially what it means is that, you have to lead in this with a spirit of hope and do what you can, because otherwise you're not going to get anything done. And there's a particular unit at RMI that looks at, among other things, kind of the exponential growth curves of a lot of different technologies that are evolving out there and just how far costs have fallen, oftentimes along the lines of where we need to be to meet our Paris goals, even in spite of all the bad news that we are hearing. There's a lot of turbulence in the way, obviously, and the progress across the board is not as far along as we would like, but there is good news out there. So I think part of it, I would say, is just regulate your media diet to make sure that you're not just consuming only like the bad news clickbait, because there is good news out there. It's just not always as, in your face.
Fair point.
If you haven't watched Hannah Ritchie's TED Talk or read her book, Not the End of the World, I think that's a good antidote for the catastrophizing that some people do. The world is not great, but some things are getting better.
Mm-hmm.
And these problems are not insolvable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think it sounds like my mother talking to me. People are really trying hard. There's pockets of excellence all over the place, and nothing is monumental is going to sweep over the world and fix everything. But I mean, in our business, we look a lot at and I think Pascal alluded to a little bit in aluminum with green steel. That's going to be a significant reduction. If we can get it to a point where it's used more broadly, maybe a bit cheaper, things like that. We've got transport companies, container ships. I forget the manufacturer. I mean, the shipping company, but they actually have a container ship that's using sails. They're trying it to see if that would work instead of using diesel fuel in that ship. I don't know how effective that's going to be. Don't know how efficient that's going to be. Obviously, a container ship is huge, but it's people are thinking out of the box, and these are small steps in the right direction. And arguably not one of those is really going to make it change. But my opinion is a combination of a lot of these small ideas are going to grow large enough to start having a meaningful impact. But you know, I mean, at Deere, we believe that the fastest way to reduce our carbon emissions is green energy. That's the number one thing we can do. There's a lot of things we can do. That's the one that'll have the most impact. So there's a tremendous focus on buying wind power, buying solar power, retrofitting our factories with solar energy where it makes sense, things like that. But I think this is one of those things where there's not one big win or one big technology that's going to knock it out of the park. It's going to be a combination of a lot of people all over the world, a lot of people doing different things. I think about one supplier, Kansas, a very small supplier to Deere. They had this great idea. What they do is they drag the Mississippi River for plastic. They take it and they recycle it into pallets instead of wood. I'm thinking, that's decent, that's neat. Doesn't make a big deal. And then you got to think about what the heck do you do with this plastic pallet when it's time to retire it. But it's people thinking like that and trying to take small steps in the right direction, in my opinion.
So one
Absolutely.
project that I worked on in my academic career is kind of, you know, it started kind of late in the pandemic, and it was really kind of modeling. We're kind of trying to integrate information and evidence on these like different feedback mechanisms that operate across kind of technology, society, politics, and to kind of model like the trajectory of climate policy and how that will then shape the kind of future of global emissions. It's something that's really hard to do. It's maybe like the reason like this doesn't get done in most climate economy modeling. But you know, it was a really valuable exercise because what it did, it highlighted that there is the potential for a series of kind of cascading feedbacks, and that, you know, it's not set in stone. There's a lot of uncertainty, but like you can generate this inertia in the system that kind of you know, provides its own like momentum, and that, you know, I think that, you know, and that really does constrain the space of emissions that we're likely to see over the kind of like later part of the century in a way that to me was quite positive. And I do think we see some evidence of that. And this is like, I think, you know, Arik mentioned this already, that like there's potentially some kind of political kind of sticking power to a lot of the IRA, that we have an incoming administration where climate is certainly not a priority in kind of many ways, like kind of they would like to roll back some of these investments. And, you know, it might well be that the nature of like how this bill operated is going to make that tricky. And that's just one example from the US, but I think there is a kind of a lot of momentum, and that when we as humans, we tend to extrapolate linearly, but these systems are nonlinear, and therefore you can get these accelerations that can really take you by surprise, and those can be negative, but they can also be positive as well.
That's so awesome. I love that it's hard to do, but you did it. Anyone else have a response for this question? All right. Awesome. And if after that you're still feeling a little bit overwhelmed and hopeless, just know that Christina and I will hit the job market in May 2025, and that should give you hope. So we're gonna move on actually to audience questions.
Yeah, so moving to our Q&A section. Our first audience question is for specifically Wallas or Dr. Pascal. How do you view the competitive landscape for sustainability transparency? Could publicly sharing life cycle assessments encourage industry-wide adoption, or do you see hesitancy to do so because of cost and so forth?
I can take a stab at it, and Wallas can complete. I strongly believe in the transparency. I alluded to it earlier in the conversation. We're about disclosure, but it's got to be a level playing field. And this is about leading by example as well. So although there might be a cost to it, I think this is something that we need to tackle, and then people will follow. I think it's important that regulating bodies have that into their mind as well when they're imposing disclosure or regulations, that there is a cost attached to it. And so it needs to be done, thinking about it really hard.
Nothing more than I agree 1000%. I mean, one of the things we struggled with was the actual, how can I say it? Not necessarily reporting, the accuracy / transparency reporting. And quite frankly, we do a lot internally, but we also leverage external organizations to come in, look at what we do, audit it. Yep, make sure it's right. But to Pascal's point, the key is there's got to be a level playing field. Everybody can't go off and measure the way they want and produce whatever numbers they want. And that's why we tend to think about the idea of the umpire, referee, or the objective third party to do that for us, or to put the thumb stamp on what we've done to say, yes, this is accurate, and it's what you said it is.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's really interesting considering, the SEC regulations and like how they're attempting to kind of create a baseline for all companies. So it's super relevant to the current state right now. To our second audience question, and this is open to all. Many of you mentioned trade-offs between cost and sustainability. How do you prioritize these trade-offs, specifically in sectors where upfront costs for sustainable practices are high? We'll leave it to CMU students to make us think very hard.
I'll answer within my own field. The top goal of the climate action plan is to grow our ridership. Like I said, there's a ridership benefit to the climate overall if we just get more people to use transit. And so typically things are put through that filter before anything else. If it's an added cost and it doesn't increase ridership or can't be conceived to increase ridership in any way, then chances are it's not got legs to stand on for very long. If it can be construed plausibly as increasing ridership, i.e., is it in line with our mission as an organization? Is it an investment worthy of doing for that purpose rather than just as some act of like altruism, or as we've said in previous answers, like performance? Then it's got much stronger chances of surviving.
Thank you. Any other reactions?
And from go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that it's important to distinguish between two things. One is many of these are relationships between private costs and public benefits. When I walk the extra 10 steps to recycle my can, that's a private cost I incur. The benefits to the public are the reduced emissions from smelting aluminum. When I ride my bike to work, that's a private cost, and to the extent it's a cost, the benefit is the lower pollution in the Washington, D.C. area. But some of them are trade-offs between costs of reducing carbon emissions and costs and other costs we might incur to do other good things. And in economics, we have a measure called cost effectiveness. And so the idea is that, let's say our goal is reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. We want to do that in the least costly way. And I want to include in the cost that we incur to reduce those carbon emissions, all of the costs, including foregone money we could have spent on housing, foregone money we could have spent on children's education. Those are the costs we incur to reduce carbon emissions. And so there are lots of ways to reduce carbon emissions. Some of them are really expensive ways. And so we're going to have to forego a lot of that other good stuff. And some of them are less expensive ways. And so we would sacrifice few of our other goals. And so cost effectiveness is sort of an easier concept to get our heads around than just trading off these costs and benefits.
Yeah, completely agree. Anyone else?
Think about cost. I mean, there's cost that the organization is willing to bear. There's cost that can cost that potentially get passed on to customers. And so it's probably one of the more measuring sustainability is one thing. The cost of it is equally as challenging, in my opinion. We've developed several models of how we believe doing something that's in a more sustainable fashion will affect our costs. And everyone we've ever done, in reality, when you do it, it's different. It's something different there, and it's because of unintended consequences or unintended effects downstream. So I don't have a good answer. I just know it's a very complicated question. I know our organization, for one, is working really hard. Something as simple as sourcing a metal part. If you source it from a company in the U.S. that's using green energy and this and that, versus it's 20%, it's 20 or 30% cheaper in another country where they don't have these things. How much of that cost do I put into my analysis of which way I go? And then ultimately, how much of that then goes on to the customer, or do we absorb it and try to offset it internally as well? So it's we've got probably as many accounting and finance people working on it as we do people in supply chain and people in sustainability, for that matter. And then it's not to blow the question away. It's just a very complicated question. And in the end, it's up to the decision-making authorities of the business to say, this is one we're willing to do, or this is one we're not going to do, or we can't recoup it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, to me, this and gets at this kind of coming back to this idea that, this move towards sustainability at heart is a kind of collective endeavor. And, that this tension between kind of, as Arik put it, kind of private costs and public benefits is kind of quite fundamental, and it's going to limit the actions that any one kind of company is going to be able to do realistically in a competitive business environment. And that really, like, the solution to a lot of this is public in nature, and that, maybe the kind of most effective, or at least like one very effective route for kind of sustainability offices in the private sector is really to be lobbying the government to kind of say, well, why don't you set rules so that, we want to do this, but, our competitors should have to do this as well. And that's going to put everyone on a level playing field. But that's something companies can't do themselves. I mean, to some extent they can in these kind of voluntary kind of like labeling standards and sustainability clubs. But it's going to be most effective if it's done publicly.
I can maybe bring an example to illustrate that, Fran. The European Union is working on carbon border adjustment legislation. Basically, if you've got metal production facilities in Norway powered by hydro, but the hydropower is at the moment super expensive, and then on a global scale, your production becomes non-competitive, you're shutting down your facilities in Europe, and then you start importing that metal from China, for example, which is producing the same metal, but based on brown coal fire power station. And then the CO2 footprint of that is 5, 6, 7-fold higher. You're importing that into Europe and using it. So you've leaked your carbon to another country. So as a whole, we're worse off. So the European Union is trying to get the level playing field here, saying that, hey, if you're using metal in Europe, you're going to pay a penalty if you're bringing it from a source that's higher carbon. And then it helps the local manufacturer maintain competitivity. I'm sorry. And also we're all better for it as well, because then the carbon footprint is much, much lower.
Thank you. Any final reactions? Okay. Well, we are getting a little red ding. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Muller for some closing remarks. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. So first, to our moderators, who were absolutely fantastic. Thank you both. Thank you also to all of our panelists for your insights and thoughts and your time. And thanks to our numerous participants that were in the audience. This is a great event every year. It certainly was this year. So again, on behalf of Carnegie Mellon, the Scott Institute, and the Tepper School of Business, thank you all. Have a great weekend and have a peaceful holiday season. Bye-bye.